Hi, we're going to be finishing up Chapter 20 today on hypotheses about the origin of life. And I do want to emphasize again, this is a hypothesis we're going through today. This isn't theory. We're going to talk about how basically we could form life from just a collection of chemicals that are grouping together here. So, our thoughts are, how could this happen? Well, probably the first thing we would have on our way to actual biochemicals would not be things like complex carbohydrates or proteins or lipids. Probably it'd be something very simple, something more like at most amino acids. We talked in the first half about how amino acids can spontaneously form under the right conditions. So maybe we have something like amino acids that start to kind of group together, make small polypeptides. Well, as you get larger and larger molecules, these large molecules may start to act almost like a living thing and kind of like eat other molecules. So we say they kind of act like heterotrophs. In fact, this hypothesis we're discussing is sometimes called the heterotroph hypothesis. But basically, something that would be a polypeptide might start eating things like maybe sugar molecules, or maybe just even small inorganic molecules that would become a part of it, become incorporated. Now, eventually, if this happens, you may end up with a molecule large enough, we can truly call it a large polymer, that may be like a protein or something like a lipid, or maybe a collection of a few of these. Now, it's not unheard of to have molecules acting almost like rogue organisms here doing something, because even today we know that there are proteins that kind of go around and infect things. We call them prions, and a fairly famous disease caused by just a rogue protein is mad cow disease. There are also similar diseases that infect humans, not just cows too, but come about from just proteins that aren't acting like normal proteins. They're kind of doing their own thing. Now, again, let's say we end up with some lipids or some proteins forming. Once you have something that is large and functional that is formed spontaneously, now what we need to do is find some way to make more copies of that, because that's one thing our bodies do, is we make more and more of the molecules that we need. You can't have just one large, macromolecule going around doing things. It's got to be able to reproduce. So how can this large molecule copy itself? Well, one idea that some people have come up with is that maybe it would almost be done like the way we can make copies of things in an art class, where you could maybe sculpt an object and then take some clay, press that object into the clay, and leave an impression behind that you could then use to make more copies. Well, how about actual clay particles, which tend to be very small, very easily fit into little gaps in other molecules? Maybe clay particles could leave an impression behind when something like a protein lands in there. When it leaves, the impression left behind would maybe be shapes that specific amino acids could fit into to make more proteins like the original one. Other people have speculated that maybe one of the molecules that spontaneously formed was something like RNA. Now, if you remember the difference between DNA and RNA, DNA is a much larger molecule that just simply stores information and then can act as a template for having more copies made. However, RNA is the active molecule. It's the one that actually can build polypeptides, and yet RNA also can store information. So maybe if RNA would spontaneously form, you could get some very simple, maybe a gene would form, and that gene could be copied to make more copies of the same gene, and that gene could also be used to assemble then some polypeptides or proteins based on that. So maybe that would be the direction this could happen. Well, regardless, once you have some large molecules, the next step to really lead toward life would be to have cells, because molecules are not alive, cells are alive. So how do you get from big molecules to cells? Well, one thing we do know is if you have a bunch of phospholipids, if you remember the head that will mix with water and the two tails hanging down that don't, so we call the head hydrophilic, the tails are called hydrophobic. If you have a bunch of phospholipid molecules and they're in a watery environment, which most of the Earth is a watery environment, those phospholipid molecules will spontaneously form into bilayered membranes. You get something roughly spherical that has the heads on the outside and the inside with the tails clustering together, which we saw back in our chapter earlier on cell membranes. Now, if you would form this, what's basically a cell membrane now, and have on the inside trapped in there some large molecules that are functional, things like proteins, those molecules on the inside would be protected from the environment, more likely to be able to reproduce and make more copies of themselves and function, because they'd be protected somewhat from the outside environment. Same as our DNA and our proteins inside our cells are protected by being inside a cell membrane. The more protected they are, given time, the more likely they are to continue to become more and more complex as things happen over many, many years. Now, if you have different cells, a large cell maybe could consume a small cell and not digest it, bring it in and make it a part of itself. If you remember back on our chapter on cells, we talked about how both mitochondria and chloroplasts have very, very compelling evidence that they maybe were prokaryotic cells that were ingested and not digested by larger cells. Maybe that's where these internal compartments came from. Something like a mitochondria was a small cell, a larger cell kind of ate it, the small cell ended up inside, and that small cell was really good at doing cellular respiration. It then did cellular respiration for the entire large cell. Then you can get from simple little prokaryotic cells that spontaneously form to eukaryotic cells. Now, what we end up looking at here then is, how do we then get from single-celled organisms to all the complexities we see today? Well, according to what we see in the fossil record, which the further back in time you go, the harder it is to interpret, because the fewer the organisms are that will actually fossilize well. But every indication seems to be that the first life on Earth probably was prokaryotic, which doesn't seem too surprising. It is the simplest life form. It makes sense that it would be the first thing that would exist. And it took roughly a little over 1 billion years to go from prokaryotic life to the first signs of eukaryotic life. So we are talking about this progression of molecules to simple cells to complex cells. It's something that takes a few years. We're talking over 1 billion years from the first signs of prokaryotic life to the first signs of single-celled compartmentalized cells, eukaryotic cells. And the first eukaryotic cells seem to be about 2.5 billion years ago. It still, after that, took more than another 1 billion years before you go from eukaryotic cells to multi-celled organisms. And the first ones would have been something roughly like, basically pond scum, algae, that then starts to form more and more complex things that are more like true plants. And that was about 1.2 billion years ago, according to the fossil record. We believe that the first true multi-celled organisms are showing up. So we are talking really, really, really long periods of time for these things to form. Now, from the time we have the first multicelled plants, then things start to move a little bit quicker. Once we have multicelled life, then things seem to start evolving much more quickly, because we're not needing to form things quite so much from scratch. We're now starting to be able to do descent with modification, and it only took roughly 300 million years or so, which is still a very, very long time to have 300 million years, but about that long for animals and fungi to start to show up. Now, what we like to do is kind of look at a record, and this text is probably going to be too small for you to look at, but just to kind of give you an idea what we're talking about here. The oldest date on this particular chart is 570 million years ago, and that's the beginning of a time period called the Cambrian period. Time before the Cambrian, called the Precambrian, is really very, very simple life forms and not many things that fossilize well. So we don't know a whole lot about life before the Cambrian. But starting the Cambrian, that's when we start seeing really complex, especially animal life forms. And pictured here is a trilobite, which is one of the most famous fossils from some of these older time periods. And trilobites were around for a long period of time. But in this time period, it's one of the main things we see. And as we progress to more and more recent times, we start to see things that look more familiar, more similar to what we see today. All the way up here, this time period here is called the Pennsylvanian period. This is when we start to see things that look truly like the insects we have today, although much larger. The insects used to be, according to the fossil record, again, much larger than what we see today. When we get to the Permian time period here, we start to see things that look a little bit more reptile-like, and then we eventually get into things that are more dinosaur-like. The most famous period probably is the Jurassic period, probably due to the movie Jurassic Park. Although actually most of the dinosaurs that were in Jurassic Park, the majority, are actually from the Cretaceous period, which is right up in here. But I guess Cretaceous Park doesn't have the same ring to it. And then the Tertiary period, which is after the majority of the dinosaurs became extinct. The Tertiary period is kind of the birth of what we see as mammal life forms being more dominant. Our current period, the Quaternary period, is this very, very tiny little sliver up at the top here, just roughly the last 1.5 million years. I'm going to show you the same thing kind of blown up and just kind of give you an idea of how things have progressed, and this way you can maybe see some of these forms a little bit more. But again, we're going to start at the Cambrian period, because in the Precambrian we don't really know much of what was here. But we see several different trilobite life forms. These are all things that live in the ocean. And life forms start to get more complex. I'm going to just slide the picture down here as we move toward more recent time periods. Some life forms that to us look really fairly bizarre. And my picture jumped on me a little bit there. But we can see more things that start to look similar to what we see today. And more and more things that look like, but not exactly like, modern life forms. And then we're starting to see some dinosaurs showing up, although the earliest forms aren't any dinosaurs that truly fit that category, that name dinosaur. My picture jumped on me again here. Let me see if I can grab that one more time. And what we're seeing is now a rise in, like I say, much more complex life forms. And as we move toward today and what we see in today, we're seeing the dying out of so many of these life forms that are more bizarre, and we're seeing a progression toward more and more, of course, mammals today. I can't get my picture to set for me here, so I'm going to pause for a second and reset it. And I'm back. I fixed my picture error here. So, again, moving toward more recent time periods, we can see the dinosaurs, and then rather abruptly at the end of the Cretaceous period, which is when we believe that probably an asteroid slammed into the planet, we see the end of these reptile-like large organisms and the birth of first some very bizarre mammal and bird life forms that were very large, kind of awkward looking, often very large horns, large tusks, large antlers on some of these things. And then moving toward, in of course, the recent times, the beginning of things that are the primates kind of taking over and being the dominant life form. But we are in the Quaternary Period up here as a very, very recent life form as you look at the entire history of life on Earth. Well, that's the end of Chapter 20. As always, bring your questions to class, and I hope you have a great day. Goodbye.